DevOps. We hear this term among CIOs and IT people, and you hear a lot of prominent people talking about DevOps. And yet, what is DevOps? What's the background? What does it actually mean? So today, on episode number 127, I will be speaking with Gene Kim, who is an author, a company founder, and one of the central figures in the DevOps movement. I'm Michael Krigsman, and welcome to CXOTalk. Gene.
Hey, thanks so much, Michael. It's been a long time since we've done something like this. It's great to see you again.
It is great to talk with you. We've known each other for a long time, and we've presented together. And Gene, welcome to CXOTalk.
I'm delighted to be here. And by the way, I'm so sad that Vala can't be here. I found this book right next to my desk, so I wanted to show that to him.
I know, Vala, and we'll hopefully see you on Friday, Vala, for our next show. So, Gene, give us a sense of your professional background. Let's start there to set some context.
Yeah, I've spent now 16 years studying high-performing technology organizations. And so these were those organizations that had the best project due date performance and development, the best operational stability and reliability, as well as the best posture of security and compliance. And so our goal was always to understand how do these remarkable organizations make their good to great transformation so that the rest of us could replicate their amazing outcomes. And so one of the big surprises in my journey was that it took me straight into the heart of the DevOps movement, which I think is so urgent and important because it really is a transformation of how we do work, very much replicating how manufacturing was transformed through the application of lean principles in the 1980s. So there's no doubt in my mind that how we work with technology now is changing, and that 10 years from now we'll look back and say it transformed. And so how we went from here to there, I think, is what the DevOps movement is all about.
So you founded a company, or you were chief technology officer and one of the founders of a company called Tripwire, and then you started IT Revolution Press and you wrote a book. So tell us about your book, The Phoenix Project.
So the Phoenix Project is based on one of my favorite books. It's called The Goal by Dr. Eliyahu Goldratt. And so that was written in the 1980s, and it's now integrated into almost every mainstream MBA curriculum. And it's a surprising book because it's a novel. It's a novel about a plant manager who has to fix his cost and due date issues in 90 days. Otherwise, they shut the plant down. And so this novel is, you see the problems that were part of almost every manufacturing plant around the planet and see the transformation through the eyes of the person who was undertaking this transformation. And so when I read that book, oh my goodness, 18, 20 years ago, there was no doubt in my mind that the lessons in the book were relevant to any leader in technology. And so, for over a decade, it's been our aspiration to write the goal, but for the IT context, very much at the technology leader, who is, I think, occupies the same space in our economy as manufacturing did 30 years ago. So that's what the Phoenix Project did. And I would call it's an homage to the goal about problems that almost every technology leader has around project due date performance, about operational stability and reliability, and especially in the age of security breaches, how to maintain an adequate security posture and compliance, right, to protect, data, applications, and the goals of the organization.
Gene, I remember when you were writing that book, and we had lots of conversations about IT failures and how DevOps can prevent IT failures and the communication issues between IT and the business. And so DevOps has something to do with all of that. So tell us, give us a context and overview of DevOps.
Yes, I think both a passion that you and I have is around the taxonomy and the causes of large project failures and technology failures. And I think, we can almost characterize what contributes to project failures. I think one of the large characteristics is that projects that fail tend to take a long time, multiple year projects, right? And obviously, if you're talking about a long time, you're talking about a lot of money, right? Often, and then as you get, into the project execution, one of the things that you often see is all the testing put at the end of the project. And so when testing appears at the end, often that's when the timelines are already so compressed that there's no time to even fix the issues that are uncovered during the testing process. And then that's not the end of the project, right? The project is only creating value for our customers when it's actually operating in production. And so then we get to the next step, which is actually the deployment and the release of the software into the production environment. And in my mind, if we look at some of the largest project failures, often they've ended in fury catastrophes. I'm thinking about the Toys R Us deployment in 1999, Amazon 2001, LinkedIn 2009, the recent US healthcare.gov deployment some years ago. And so if we look at one of the common causes or contributing factors behind those type of deployment errors or deployment catastrophes, usually it's because that they've been only deploying only at the end of the project. So what DevOps represents is almost the exact opposite. Organizations are doing tens, hundreds, or even thousands of deployments per day without causing chaos and disruption to the environment or let alone to our customers. And they're achieving world-class reliability, stability, and security, which is something that we didn't even think possible 5 years ago. And in my mind, it's just so heartening to see these DevOps principles and practices being adopted, not just by organizations like Amazon, Etsy, Google, Netflix, but increasingly as organizations like Capital One, GE Finance, Raytheon, Nordstrom, Target, Macy's, large complex organizations that have been around for 10 decades or even over a century. And one of the we had aggregated all these speakers at a conference called the DevOps Enterprise Conference, and one of the actually by far the most popular talk was actually given by Mark Schwartz, the CIO of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, part of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So it just shows that
one of our guests on CXOTalk, in fact.
One of my favorite episodes, by the way. So I think it's so exciting to see how the way we do work is being transformed. Also, another exemplar is the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, another guest on your show. So I think DevOps is not just for technologists. It is relevant for any leader, not just technology leaders, but business leaders as well.
So DevOps, you have the developer part and you have the operations part. So maybe split these out and explain what DevOps actually is.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think to be precise, I think what DevOps represents is a set of principles that it is the emergent set of patterns that result in very fast flow of work from dev through test into operations while preserving world-class reliability, stability, and security. And so these are, not only does it create fast flow and reliability, it creates a safe system of work that allows small teams to quickly, independently develop, test, and safely deploy the code to customers. And this also allows us to maximize developer productivity. So in the eyes of a developer, I think how DevOps changes our work is that developers are working in close to a production-like environment, in their daily work. So instead of testing our code in a production-like environment only during the production release 1 year after you wrote the code, you're going to be running in production ideally on the same day that you wrote it. For operations, it means that instead of doing work that comes out of the ticketing machine, instead of being involved only at the last stages of the project, we are helping create the automation required to increase developer productivity, to make these environments available on demand, to allow automation that helps developers be productive. And what all this means is that the organization can achieve its goals, whether it's around delivering new features to the customer, whether it's being reliable and stable and secure to protect organizational commitments, and passing audits. So I think it really does change how we do work, whether we're in dev, test, operation, and security.
But I'm still confused though, because is DevOps and a thing? Is it a philosophy of life? Because what you're describing, which is work in relatively short cycles, produce concrete results quickly that everybody can see and then share it. It sounds like just sort of the I'll put common sense in quotes, common sense way that people are working today with some type of agile or iterative development. So what is DevOps?
Yeah, I think DevOps the DevOps movement has, I think, tried to stay away from being very prescriptive. But I would say DevOps encompasses all the cultural norms. It's the processes, it's the procedures, it's the cultural norms, it's the technical practices. All of those things, right, have in combination result in outcomes. I mean, I guess maybe another way to say it is, I think from my perspective, I don't care so much about the practices and procedures. I care about the outcomes, right? We know that high performers deploy 30 times more frequently than the non-high performers. They can do a production deployment in minutes, not months, right? They have a change success rate when they deploy into production that's twice as high, and they're 12 times faster to restore issues when things go wrong. So I would say DevOps is all those practices that allow us to do these incredible things that we didn't even think possible 5 years ago. Do work more quickly while being more reliable and stable. And so over the past 3 years, we've done a lot of benchmarking to understand what are the behaviors and practices that best predict performance. And there are about 7 things that we found that were prerequisites to high performance. One was operations using version control. So I think, by the way, most of us were trained. Version control was for developers or maybe development teams. And what we found in our research was that everybody in the value stream must be using version control, especially operations, because that's where the most amount of variance occurs. We found that also required was automated testing. In other words, we have to be able to test whatever we put into version control so that we have confidence that we're going to have good outcomes when we actually deploy into production, as opposed to testing only at the end of the project and having armies of people execute the test plans that are encoded in the Word docs. We need proactive monitoring in the production environment so that when something goes wrong, we find out first before our customers do, right? So that we can detect issues and correct them quickly. We need high trust cultures. And by the way, this is something that can only come from leadership, is to set the cultural norms that are high trust, where we actively seek information. We encourage bridging between teams. So it's not dev, ops, security at each other's throats. Instead, they all share a common goal of making developers productive, being productive and secure, and that we treat failures as causing something of genuine inquiry. We don't create a witch hunt trying to find who made a mistake. Instead, we're trying to create organizational learning so that we can prevent the bad thing from happening again. If we can't prevent it, at least enable quicker detection and recovery. So these sound like technical practices, but I think there's more than that. It is technical practices, cultural norms that allow organizations to do great things that we haven't seen before. By the way, Mike, I love your comment though. Is it just common sense? Yeah, I think it is just common sense, but I think what we all know over decades is that common sense is rarely common practice. And I think that's really the goal of the DevOps movement.
So is it a manifesto? So I again, and I'm not trying to be difficult, Gene, but I'm trying to see, so how is DevOps communicated? Is like I say, is there a manifesto? Is it handed down from father to son and mother to daughter and CIO to IT person working in the IT department? How is it communicated, and how do you get people on the same page?
Yeah, what a great question. And these are the answers that I've been, these are the questions that I've been seeking to help answer. And I think my personal passion right now is trying to understand, how are the exemplars in the DevOps community doing what they do? And how do we accelerate the rate of transformation across all industry verticals? And then how do we increase the success rate when people embark a DevOps transformation, which makes people like Mark Schwartz, like Courtney Kistler at Nordstrom, like Heather Mickman and Ross Clanton at Target, the journey that's being undertaken at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. The goal of the DevOps Enterprise Summit is really to understand and collect the experience reports of how these organizations are transforming, what went wrong, what are the biggest problems, so that we can increase success rates as we go forward. By the way, one of my favorite parts of the DevOps Enterprise Summit last year was I asked every one of the 50 speakers to end with one slide with the following one of two titles. Here's what I don't know how to do, or here's what I'm looking for help on. And what we came out was essentially a research roadmap, because the top 5 issues that were being verbalized were: 1, what are the cultural issues around transition, especially for leaders? 2 is, what are the roles and responsibilities, especially for next generation IT operations? 3 is, everybody wants to go faster. Dev, ops, the organizations that we serve, but people in security and compliance keep saying no. The most important one was, how do you build automated testing for legacy application where we are often 100% reliant on manual testing? And the 5th is metrics. What metrics can we use to drive our DevOps improvement programs? And so the entire program for the DevOps Enterprise Summit in October is really organized around trying to answer those questions. And I think by doing things like this, we can help the community of leaders that are pushing DevOps transformations, help better achieve their goals. And I think we elevate the state of the practice in our industry.
So in effect then, and correct me if I'm wrong, DevOps is it's a set of practices, a philosophy, and therefore a set of practices that can take expression in many different ways. But fundamentally, and I don't know if the term govern, I was going to say govern the interactions between development people, operations people, and the business people.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, and it sounds so like a platitude. It sounds like a kumbaya moment, and yet, there's nothing laughable about culture, right? And I think Dr. Stephen Spear at MIT, he said, what culture really is a trained response in an organization of how we respond to stimulus, right? And so part of the goal of, part of the responsibility of leadership is to set those cultural norms. And as we know from our common experiences, Michael, right, when we have leadership that don't trust each other, right, terrible things happen. And that happens especially acutely when you have organizations like development and operations, where they have almost at times diametrically, pathologically opposite goals. You have development who's motivated by get that feature to market quickly, right? And that means make changes faster than ever. And on the other hand, you have operations who's measured on reliability and stability, and that leads to the desired outcome of make no changes ever. And so you take those 2 diametric opposite goals and you put them next to each other in the org chart, right? Terrible things happen. I think even how we organize ourselves, almost in some extent, preordains, the outcomes. And so DevOps is about organization, it's about culture, cultural norms, governance, policies, and most importantly, how we do daily work.
So, in my past life, I studied why IT projects fail. I know, crazy thing, but somebody's got to do it. And I probably wrote as much about that topic as probably almost anybody on the planet. And you have deep expertise as well. And one of the primary reasons that IT projects, and I think this really is true with any type of project, one of the primary reasons that projects tend not to work is because of disconnects in terms of the goals, the expectation, and then the communication, right, among the various groups. Because these types of projects, by their nature, cut across multiple groups, multiple departments, very often multiple companies, because there's different organizations involved. So how does DevOps prevent failures that arise as a result of these types of miscommunications and expectation and alignment issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, here are some concrete examples of how I think DevOps embodies the notion of shared goals. And they all sound contrarian and certainly, controversial. But one of them is this pattern where developers wear pagers, right? This notion that if you, Werner Vogels, he's the CTO of Amazon, he said, if you built it, you must run it, right? And so maybe if we soften that a little bit and saying, if you help build it, you must help run it. I think this is the opposite of what we see in most organizations, where developers will write code and then the operations people will deploy it and then run it and get woken up at 2 a.m. I think there's a quote from Patrick Lightbody. He's now he's head of product management at New Relic. He said, "We found that when we woke up developers at 2 a.m., defects got fixed faster than ever. And I love that quote because it really does show that, without that shared incentive of creating things that are stable and predictable and reliable in operations, often we end up with these pathologically bad outcomes where you just throw stuff over the wall, right? And operations must live with it, and it starts to accrue technical debt, and then operation drowns in unplanned work and is unable to actually fulfill its commitments to the organization. I think another example is, just like in manufacturing, there was this movement called design for manufacturing. What the breakthrough was is that they found that often the industrial engineers were designing parts in such a way that made them very prone to be misconnected in production, or it was easy to over-tighten screws or put things on backwards. And so the design pattern was, let's make these things impossible to misassemble. The parts would be wildly asymmetrical. It would be impossible to over-tighten. And so the equivalent in our space is you design for operations so that you have resilience built into how we architect applications. We actually we make it impossible to misconfigure. We actually we break things in production so that we have practice fixing things when things go wrong, so that we know how to handle things that would be catastrophic to another organization. That's just another part of daily work. So, I think these are examples of behaviors and incentive structures that create wildly different outcomes that we would see in a typical failed IT project. And it's not just for Amazon and Google. This is for organizations like the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. It's for Macy's. It's for real organizations that have been doing real great things for decades.
So when you say design for resilience, are you talking about technology, or are you talking about communication among people?
Yeah, I think it's both. One of the famous stories in the DevOps community is the first Amazon cloud failure that happened in 2011. It was April 22nd, 2011. This is when the Amazon East data centers went down, and it took down Quora, it took down Reddit, it took down almost every Amazon customer, with one very curious exception, which was Netflix. And so for weeks, everybody was asking, what is Netflix doing differently that caused such a different outcome for them? And so the leading theory was, it's obvious. Netflix is Amazon's largest customer. Clearly, Amazon gave them a special, feature that, said, do not crash, right? That allowed them to sort of survive the outage. But the real answer was revealed some weeks later in this famous blog post that essentially revealed two critical decisions that they had made very early on, years earlier. One was that we can have no single point of failure risk, of which Amazon was one of them. They said, Amazon will never be there when we need them most. But the second design decision was even more astonishing. They said, in order to survive failure, we're going to have to fail all the time. And that's when they unveiled this thing called Chaos Monkey. So Chaos Monkey, of course, is this now famous piece of code that they ran daily, and it randomly kills production servers, and it randomly kills processes, in production, every day in the cloud. And so you can imagine, once they started running this, they became very good at surviving outages. And so I think, is it a technology? Yes. But is it a startling cultural norm that would be considered crazy in most organizations? I think that too, the answer is yes. I think, we will know that DevOps is here, whether it's 5 years from now or 10 years from now, when that becomes a widely adopted practice. Incidentally, one of the things that Mark Schwartz talked about in his keynote at the DevOps Enterprise Summit was the fact that they were doing Chaos Monkey-like testing before the launch of the new immigration application. Why? Because he wanted to have confidence that when they announced and released the functionality to citizens and citizens to be, that it would actually work in production, under production-like loads. So, I think it's just another great example of how these practices are being adopted, across every industry vertical.
We have a question from Alan Berkson, who asks, what about DevOps and ITIL? And explain ITIL very quickly for people who don't know what that is.
Yeah, ITIL is something that I have a great deal of appreciation for. In fact, a previous book I had written was around, how do you sort of bootstrap ITIL processes? So what ITIL represents is the codification of all the underpinning processes we need within IT operations to get world-class availability. And it was written by the Office of the OGC, part of the British government. And so it defines how we do change management, configuration management, release management, vendor management, and so forth. And I would say that there's no doubt in my mind that you can make them consistent with each other. But I think what is different about DevOps that has significant implications on ITIL is how we do the change management and configuration management practices as well as release. In other words, I think ITIL worked very well when we were doing maybe hundreds or thousands of changes per week. But with DevOps, we're potentially doing hundreds or thousands of changes per day. And so this means that we can't have manual configuration management practices. We can't have a lot of change approval boards. We can't do releases manually. I think what DevOps really does is automates the release management process to make it very predictable so that we can do them on demand and even have them performed by developers, which is something that I think was very alien to ITIL and auditors. It means that configuration management is done automatically. And I think how we approve changes is done very differently. There was a talk from Salesforce at the DevOps Enterprise Summit that described how once they automated how they deployed code and configurations into production, they got the change management board to say those can be now considered standard changes. In other words, you don't have to get explicit approval first. However, any manual changes will still require change approvals, which would often take days or weeks. So I think these are patterns showing how organizations are adapting to these very different ways of working, recognizing that they reduce risk, as opposed to the gut reaction, which might be, oh my gosh, it increases risk.
So Gene, if an organization wants to adopt DevOps, how do they go about it?
One of the things that we noticed in the DevOps Enterprise Summit is the book, The Phoenix Project, was used often as a way to accelerate the awareness of DevOps. I think the Phoenix Project book was really designed to elicit the reaction of, holy cow, this is us. Right? The organization being this fictional organization that's at the brink of existential failure due to a failed project and having chronic uptime issues and security and audit issues. It was really based on 15 years of experience seeing organizations go through the same cycle over and over again, trapped in this downward spiral. So we're also working on another book that will come out later this year called the DevOps Cookbook, which is really intended to be the prescriptive companion guide to the Phoenix Project, describing how did the organization in the Phoenix Project achieve their seemingly miraculous outcomes. And that book is really based on the study of high performers have gone through their transformation. Another way that we're working on helping the community is doing this DevOps Enterprise Summit. There's no better way to learn how organizations successfully transform than hearing directly from those leaders why they started the transformation, what problems were they seeking to solve, what did they do about it, and what were their outcomes. And so in October, we'll be hosting the DevOps Enterprise Summit in San Francisco, where we're having 50 speakers again, focused on those top 5 problem areas. And I think there's going to be about 1,500 people there. And I got to tell you, there's no 3 days where I learned more than the 3 days of the conference last year, and that's fully my expectation for this year. Another thing that resource I would point people to is the DevOps Day Summits. Although I think it tends towards a more technical crowd, the fact that this was held at the USPTO offices in DC, Mark Schwartz was one of the keynote speakers. It just shows that this is something that many technical leaders of large technology organizations care about enough for them to show up and help frame the why and the how. I think shows how important the DevOps Days events have in DevOps transformations.
So we spoke about culture. So in a sense, and again, correct me if I'm wrong. So in a sense, DevOps is one part management philosophy, one part state of being, one part set of understanding of how technical organizations like IT historically tend to work with non-technical organizations like business, and then a set of practices to help these groups work together consistently based on a set of methods and mechanisms, and ultimately developing a culture, which is ingrained set of practices, we could say, so that this interaction and communication happens automatically and with great consistency. Is that fair? Or tell me when I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's a great summary of it. In fact, there's actually one more I would add. In fact, I was looking at the draft of the DevOps cookbook here, and I forgot. There's actually one other element, which is architecture. And the reason why I think this is so interesting is that the way I was trained, 15 years ago, was architecture was, you delegate away, right? That's that's not the job of a leader to care about architecture. And I think what DevOps is showing us is that the exact opposite. Is architecture is one of the most important things that a leader should be caring about. In other words, what we need to achieve high performance is an architecture that allows small groups to work with autonomy and freedom and safety without having to coordinate with hundreds or even thousands of other developers every time they want to deploy into production. And so I think the legacy of so many organizations is that everything is so tightly coupled together that every time we want to push out a small change, we have to coordinate with hundreds of other teams. But if we look at the way that organizations like Amazon, Netflix, and Google work, they have essentially been able to scale developer productivity linearly with the number of developers, right? Which is the opposite of the way so many of us were trained. What Frederick Brooks taught us in the Mythical Man Month and has taught generations of leaders is that if you double the number of developers, most likely you will double the testing effort, the integration effort, and ultimately the deployment effort to actually get it in the hands of customers. And I think what DevOps shows us is under certain conditions, we can actually break the Mythical Man Month. We can actually scale developer productivity linearly with the number of developers. And there's no technical leader who shouldn't care about that, right? Because ultimately this means, how can we keep developers productive and ultimately achieve, the goals of the organization? So you can't do that without the right architecture.
So from an IT perspective, what do we actually want from IT, and what is the lesson here for IT? And then I'm going to come back and ask you the same thing about the business side. But IT, what do we want from IT, and what are the lessons?
Yeah, I think what we want from technology has always been the same, right? I mean, ultimately, the more and more of the goals of the organization are reliant upon technology. I think 90% of all capital projects have a technology component. And 50% of all capital spending is technology related. So I think for any business leader to say that technology isn't important to us, technology can be safely outsourced to another organization with different organizational goals, I think is fallacy. So as a goal of, and by the way, it's not just about executing projects. It's about delivering services reliably, so they're available and so that they're also secure to safeguard customer data and ultimately organizational outcomes. I think what's changed, so I think that's been the same, right? 30 years ago, 40 years ago, those goals are the same. However, I think what has changed is the expectation of time to market. I think 30 years ago, Aidan Cockcroft, one of the architects who at Netflix, he's now at Battery Ventures, he made this observation. 30 years ago, back in the end of the mainframe days, large major projects would take 3 years, right, and potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. 20 years ago with open platforms, it went down to maybe a year and tens of millions of dollars. These days it may take tens of thousands of dollars. It might take a month, right? So whether it's to develop a mobile app, to deliver data analytics capability, deliver a feature, these days it's just so easy. There's no capital required. So it really is true. People want things faster. because it's cheaper and that the skill sets are out there. I think the job of and responsibility of IT leadership is how do we create that organization that can properly fulfill those commitments so that it can actually do tens, hundreds, or even thousands of deployments per day, and not waiting years, but showing concrete results in weeks or months.
But they also want, but the business also wants innovation from IT. It's one of the issues that makes the CIO job just so difficult, because you want the CIO and IT to do things better, faster, and cheaper, and yet at the same time you also want them to do things new. Help us innovate, help us push the envelope, but do it with fewer resources.
Yeah, I think one of the stories that I found most exciting and startling was a story told by Jason Cox at Disney at the DevOps Enterprise Summit last year. So his title is Director of Distributed Engineering at Disney. And so in some ways his job looks very traditional. I mean, he owns the middleware services, but he also runs a service called Embedded Ops. And so the goal of the Embedded Ops group is that whenever someone in the line of business says, hey, we want to launch this Disney story, we need 40 terabytes of storage in 3 weeks, can you help us, right? And maybe my cousin Vinny wrote it. I think in the old days, we might have said, go pound sand. There's no way that you can engage us this late in the process and get what you want from us, right? Instead, his response was, maybe we can help you, right? And so he assigned some engineers to it, and they're trying to establish, is this a 1 FTE, 2 FTE, or 3 FTE? Is this a 1, 2, or 3 engineering project? And can we onboard them onto, a capability that they had inside the organization? And so the outcome was that they were able to onboard them onto the service, give them their 40 terabytes of storage, and they were able to launch on time, in 3 weeks. And what's so amazing about the story is that they helped the business group achieve their goals. They had the capabilities internally to deliver this technically. They could help get them onboarded safely onto these platforms. And the line of business was willing to pay for it. So I think this notion of embedding operations engineers into the line of business, where they get the air cover and the funding happily paid for, and achieve things that couldn't have been done before, is just amazing. It's so different than I think the traditional sort of command and control operations organization, where we have plans that go out 7 years, and if you're not part of that plan, the business is left stranded.
Gene, I have to say, I'm just amazed at the breadth of your knowledge of this topic. I mean, it's just you are a font of wisdom and knowledge. So if we adopt DevOps, then are we going to reduce costs? So if I'm a business person and IT is coming to me and say, we're going to do this new thing, it's called DevOps. Tell me, what does it mean to me? Tell me what it means to the business person.
One of my favorite quotes on this came from Courtney Kissler. She is the head of technology for almost all the major parts of Nordstrom. And she said, our DevOps journey started when we stopped optimizing for cost and instead started optimizing for speed. Right, and so I think for them the journey was like, if we need an omni-channel retail presence that's not just physical stores, but it's e-commerce, it's mobile, etc. Right, we can't be left behind. Right, it is an existential threat, to us if we can't deliver these capabilities to the market in the situation where our average customer age gets older and older. Right, I mean, you chart that curve out far enough, right? All our customers potentially die. So I love this quote. We have to stop optimizing our technology organizations for cost and instead optimize for speed. So I think that sort of gets us out of this trap of, how do we not reduce IT operations budgets by 3%? Instead, let's have a totally different conversation of what does it take to be able to, get omni-channel capabilities. And so I think the question, does it make things cheaper? Well, it could, right? But I think the more important, I think organizations rarely win on, just cost efficiencies, right? I think these days, more and more, is actually won by innovation and time to market. And I think DevOps enables that. This idea that we can quickly deliver functionality to customers, we can experiment with functionality to understand which one actually best fulfills customer goals, right? And there's a growing school of thought that says it is by out-experimenting the competition that actually enables us to win in the marketplace. So I think it can be about cost, but I think in actuality, the calculated decision that organizations make is that, no, we're willing to pay more, right, to be able to get to market faster, to, one, get in the game, and two, win the game.
Oh, okay, Gene. Well, we have 5 minutes left, but we have a lot to talk about still. So maybe we need to talk quickly. So I'm a CIO, and I'm hearing this, and yeah, this is great. But then I go back to the office, and what management is telling me is cut the cost. Cut the cost. And I go back and I say, well, Gene Kim said that businesses win by innovation. What do I do? And they say, cut the cost. How do I respond, Gene?
Yeah, I think one of the scenes in the Phoenix Project is, I think will resonate with most technology leaders, which is, on the one hand, you have business leadership saying, we're going to cut costs another 3% this year. And yet, on the other hand, there is this endless backlog of projects that need to get done, right? And so if we were running a restaurant and there was a line around the block, in fact, no, it's not a line around the block, it's like a line around the entire city, right? At a certain point, we have to ask the question, at what point do we need to increase the number of tables, or maybe even increase the number of restaurants to satisfy demand, right? I think what this story really shows us is that what we need out of IT is so great that the survival of the organization often depends on it. And so I think we need to reframe the discussion of is what we're doing, what you're waiting for, so important that you're actually willing to fund it. And I think that really brings up the next question, which is, do you have confidence that if we had the funding that we could actually achieve those goals? So which brings up the next question, which is, if we do things the old way in large waterfall projects, right, expecting only outcomes at the end, where we don't adequately fund testing and integrate that into the daily work of dev and operations, do we really have confidence that that money is going to get transformed into the desired outcomes? And I think that's when we start having a real conversation about, do we need to do things differently? And for that, I would recommend anybody to go to the videos from the DevOps Enterprise Summit and listen to the stories from technology leaders telling these amazing stories of how they went from here to there, right? And I think it's those lessons that we're trying to codify that to help technology leaders, replicate those transformations.
So in our last couple of minutes, your final piece of advice. I'm always an advocate for the CIO, and you know as much or more about DevOps than probably anybody alive. So give the CIO advice, just short, pithy advice before we close. What should the CIO do?
I would say there's two parts. One is, we've collected all the videos and stories from the DevOps Enterprise Summit, and I would say listen to those stories to see if the problems and the solution, resonate, with you. And I think we've done a pretty good job in getting experience reports from almost every major industry vertical, from very recognized organizations with a heritage and a legacy of success. I think the second thing is look at the studies of the benchmarking that we've done. I'll send all these links to you, but we've done the State of DevOps survey that has now spanned 20,000 organizations, and with the real goal of understanding what are the behaviors and practices that lead to high performance, and for that matter, how do we measure high performance? And we measure it by lead time to go from code committed to running in production, how many times we deploy, what's your change success rate as we go into production, and what's your mean time to repair. And we found 7-8 behaviors that are mandatory for high performance, and see if that resonates with you. And I think the combination of those two things, should give us confidence to have a more concrete discussion of what's not working in the status quo, and how do we get to this ideal better state. I don't care whether we call it DevOps or not, but really DevOps is intended to be the umbrella of the common experience we have as we transform from the old bad ways to a better way that we can actually see, through our own eyes.
Well, we're just about out of time, but I tell you what, Gene, if you send me some of those links, I will put them on the CXOTalk show page for this episode, which will create a great resource for people.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. So before we leave, tell us about your upcoming conference. And I want to ask everybody, sign up for the CXOTalk newsletter. But Gene, tell us about your conference.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's going to be held on October 19th to the 21st. It's called the DevOps Enterprise Summit. You can find more information about it at devopsenterprise.io. And we'll get a promotion code just for the CXOTalk listenership for a special offer with a discount code. And I'd love to see you all there.
Fantastic. Well, we have been talking with Gene Kim, who is a company founder. He is a DevOps researcher. He is an author. He does a whole lot of things and does them really well. And this has been a true education for CXOTalk, for our listeners, on episode number 127. Gene, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Oh, Michael, congratulations on all the great work that you've done recently. And congratulations on episode 127.
Everybody, thank you so much for watching. And on Friday, we are going to be speaking with the Chief Marketing Officer for HCL Technologies, which is one of the largest Indian outsourcing firms on the face of the planet. You've been watching CXOTalk. Thank you so much. And Gene Kim, our guest, thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.